Saskatchewan. I grew up in the bush, in a community named after the connection to neighboring communities that our waterways created. So, we'll talk about the name of our community, where the rivers open up. Our community is kind of the central meeting place where 5 rivers flow into and connect a lot. Many of the communities, I think over 15 communities along those waterways. Our community is also home to a historic fur trading post. It's one of the oldest Métis communities in what is now known as Canada. And what that essentially means is we were one of the first communities in Saskatchewan to be colonized. Our community is over 250 years old. It's also home to the oldest residential school in Canada. A place where children as young as 4 years old were forcibly taken from their families and lands, relocated to schools run by nuns and priests who committed horrific harms, indoctrinated children and families to the church, and imposed fear implicitly and formally by law, banning all ties to culture, spirituality, language, and any connection to their Indigenous identity. We are no stranger to oppressive and colonial impact. I consider my backyard to span across the north, the region lush with nature, home to the fragile ecosystem of the woodland caribou, home to the vital peatlands, or muskeg as we know them, home to our medicines, the cozy bed of the caribou and her young, and the sustenance for the beaver, muskrat, moose, and many other relatives. Like the liver in our bodies, the muskeg cleanses the waters and by extension the lands. This ecosystem serves as one of North America's largest carbon sinks, the northern boreal forest. So I'm here today to share the story with people from this land and do my very best to bring a voice from Simic, as we call it, from the bush. For the muskeg, for the trees, the water, the frogs, and the skunks. For those that industry and government refuse to listen to or skew information that they share with us, I hope to bring a voice to the ancestors whose lands were stolen, children were taken, and a narrative built around their very existence and way of life as being savage and uncivilized. This is for my Kukum, who kept blueberry fields, harvested birch sap, and always prepared wild foods with the love and honor they deserve to feed our family and nourish our spirits. My work and heart is dedicated to sharing and honoring the knowledge passed down from my Kukums, from my grandmothers, who were medicine women, and they relied on the land for all their needs and the needs of the community. I work in the climate, energy, and environment space with a few different titles. I'm a board member with Indigenous Clean Energy, the Canadian Climate Institute, and an Indigenous council called Wahilatus, which gets its name from 3 Indigenous language, which ultimately translates to kinship. Wahilatus actually has recently advised Canada's electrification strategy, using this concept of kinship as guidance. And I guess first and foremost, the question that you posed was, why am I the person for this? And I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of other people that are much more well equipped to represent this case, but I guess my experience is firsthand, and I just want to declare, my role and ignorance in the industry. It goes far back. Out of high school, I received a scholarship from one of the uranium mines that I'll talk about, which is Cameco. And so I was employed as a summer student for a few years. And so I actually went on site to the Cigar Lake mine site and the McArthur River mine site and experienced what life was like in the mining industry. On my first day of work, and this is my method of sharing this through story, so you'll see I don't have slides, but my first day of work, I sat in front of this woman who was probably about 70 years old, who'd been working at the mine site for quite a few years, 20 to 30 years, and I sat there as this 18-year-old, just fresh out of high school. A few months had passed, and she sat me down and, you know, did the whole spiel on getting set up to work. And one of the first things she said to me was, be prepared to hear things and be exposed to behaviors that are unwelcomed. Essentially, be prepared to be sexually harassed. That was my first introduction to this company. And she wasn't wrong. You know, it was a warning. It was a little, you know, weird to think of now. That was over, oh my goodness, 15 years ago. And that was my first day at this mine site. And I spent 2 summers there, and I think some of the implications of how this industry lives in community, I think, is felt in many ways, right? In that experience where people are actually working in ecosystems that are unhealthy and unsafe, not only for women, but for Indigenous people. That's just one small piece of the puzzle. And then, you know, you look at when folks go back into communities and the harms that they perpetuate onto their kin, onto their communities, those are felt, those are very real. Oh my goodness, I have 2 minutes. One of the other interesting experiences that I had while on site, I was underground. One part of my summer was spent in the underground mining portion of things. And the first summer was spent actually in the quality and control part of things, where I went through all of the documents and learned all the safety process and regulation of the mines, which when you see it in practice are not followed. And then the second summer was underground, and I was doing this tour, and this man tossed me this rock, and I caught it, and I was like, whoa, that's so heavy, what is that? And he's like, that's uranium. I was like, what? And I just like threw the rock. I was like, why would you do that? And I actually spoke about that at a conference this past year. The First Nations Power Authority, who is heavily funded by nuclear, was it had this panel on the nuclear industry, and very much so talking about the potential and the power of small modular reactors and the potential and growth of the nuclear industry. And there was a former VP, vice president of Cameco, that was sitting on stage, and I told this story. There was also a doctor who was talking about the use of depleted uranium in the use of medical isotopes. All of which is false information that's shared to communities and meant to make us have hope and faith in the industry. I shared that story, and that VP of Cameco stood up and he apologized to me. He said, on behalf of the nuclear industry, I apologize for the experience that you had. I don't know who qualified him to speak for the nuclear industry, but he felt called to do that day. And so those are just like a few small experiences of my time in that space. I can only imagine other experiences of friends and family who I have direct friends and family that work in the industry. I remember a few years ago, Cameco had to change how business was going that year because of whatever was happening in the stock market. I don't even know exactly. But they let go of 700 people, 700 jobs, most of which were in northern Saskatchewan. It was devastating. And so I know the economic impacts of this industry. I think it's fair to say that there has been, benefit from that regard. But I think what we're missing, and what I think is important to consider, are the true costs. We can talk about marginal costs of energy and all of the different assets for days, but that doesn't really bring to light the true costs of what the energy industry is doing, and particularly the nuclear industry. And we're being fed these false concepts or false hopes of a solution to the energy crisis. And I think that is one of the things that I would like to see from the experts, from the judges, is to call on provincial and federal governments and the nuclear energy industry, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, to ensure that informed consent is truly informed consent. And it's not biased, and it's not built by the industry and regurgitated and delivered in community by the industry. I think we need to pay closer attention to what's happening in the nuclear industry, and particularly I would like to see questions going to the IPCC and to the International Energy Agency on the inclusion of nuclear as a cleaner or a clean energy solution to the climate crisis. I think this is very harmful to include it in such a high regard along with other renewable energy solutions and nature-based solutions that it's just not fair, and it's not telling the full story. It's talking about technology, it's not talking about true impact that's felt by the land and the people of those lands. I talked for too long and now I ran out of time. But I think maybe the questions can kind of help with that. Thank you.